Welcome to the studio. You're listening to Willow Waves, a student-produced podcast where kindergarten through 6th graders explore interests, promote solutions to global concerns, and communicate about everything related to our social and emotional learning.
We aim to amplify voices, share knowledge, and encourage conversations. Visit us at willowspringses.fcps.edu to learn more and subscribe.
Join us as we explore our diverse and dynamic world of elementary education.
Thank you for listening. I'm Elizabeth.
I'm Simar.
And I'm Norah. We are your 5th grade hosts. On today's episode, we will talk about abandoned coal mines and create a new life with reforestation. Coal mining started in the United States around 1775.
Last year, coal mining produced around $600 billion. But the downside of coal is that it accounts for more than 40% of overall global CO2 emissions. By 2029, almost a quarter of our remaining coal mines will be closed.
So, our podcast today will focus on a company called Green Forest Work that reforests closed coal mines. They have planted over 5 million trees across 9,400 acres in the United States. Today, we will interview Michael French. Thank you so much for letting us interview you. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
How about we start by just introducing ourselves and getting to know each other a bit. My name is Elizabeth Shermatinsky.
My name is Simar Chima.
I'm Norah Kim.
Hi, and I'm Michael French, Director of Green Forests Work.
What got you interested in reforestation?
Okay, yeah, so it all started when I was a kid. You know, I was always in the creek or in the forests, flipping over rocks, looking for snakes and salamanders and frogs and things like that. And when I got to college, I was still a wildlifer. You know, I just love nature, love being out in nature. And really earlier, I guess in high school, I started thinking that I might want to work for the Environmental Protection Agency and work with lands that had been polluted with toxic industrial chemicals and maybe use microbes to break those down and help to clean them up and make them better for wildlife, things of that nature. But in college, you know, I was still kind of following that wildlife track a little bit. And there were people that I was working with, and they were working with bears or elk or peregrine falcons or whatever. But I started wanting to be a restoration ecologist and thinking about what are the biggest problems in the eastern U.S. that I could work on. And one of them was the loss of the American chestnut tree. You know, it was wiped out due to the chestnut blight. I thought if we could bring that back for people and for nature, it would be a great thing. So I started working on that. But at the same time, I was looking at the destruction of tens of thousands of acres of forest due to coal surface mining throughout the region. And I started thinking, well, you know, I'm going to start working with the researchers who are doing mined land reforestation and try to tie in American chestnut restoration with that and just bring back the entire forest. Because then not only am I working with, you know, snakes and bears and bobcats, but also frogs and birds and just everything that depends on the forest. Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the Appalachian forests, you know, where you all are located and where our primary focus of work is, the Nature Conservancy has identified 4 regions of the globe that, you know, are these biodiversity hotspots and really crucial for terrestrial biodiversity. And one of them is the Amazon, which you would think about. There's an area in Borneo as well, an area north of the Serengeti, but then also the Appalachian forests. Just because there's so much of them, they're so biodiverse that they're really critically important for global biodiversity.
I had no idea that the Appalachian Forest was considered a biodiversity hotspot.
Like, gives you a lot of information about how the environment is impacting on a lot of things.
What do you think reforestation has done to help the carbon levels?
Honestly, not very much, because there's still so much forest conversion to agriculture or being lost to development, you know, urbanization, desertification, where areas are becoming deserts because of, you know, global warming and things of that nature. So reforestation hasn't done much, but it could do quite a bit if we were to really scale it up globally. But if you look back over the past, you know, approximately 20 years, since about the year 2000, globally, we've lost about 1 billion acres of forest. And we haven't created 1 billion acres of forest to replace that. So we're still fighting a losing battle in that sense that, reforestation could do a lot, but right now it really isn't.
Yeah, so we still are kind of hoping to get more people to think about the forest and kind of just help with it, because the trees, they really do take up carbon. They just suck it in and they keep it in, turn it into fresh oxygen. Did you know if you cut down a tree, all the carbon that the tree sucked in goes right back out? So it's kind of like a lose-lose, because we lose the tree and we get more carbon. Yeah.
Right. It's no longer taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Instead, it's just releasing it. It's becoming a carbon source.
Right. What part of your job would you say is the most important?
Probably fundraising. None of this happens without funding. So working with our donors, with our corporate sponsors, applying for grants from the federal government or from foundations just to raise money to do this work is the most important, because none of this would happen without the funding to make it happen. We've got to pay our contractors to go out and restore these lands using heavy equipment and purchasing trees, paying for tree planting contracts, things of that nature. So, yeah, definitely, I would say the fundraising part of my job is the most important.
Yeah, that's why we're doing this podcast, so that so that the listeners who listen to this, they might find inspiration and might want to donate some money to help out with the cause. That would be really great for all of the listeners that are listening right now.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. I mean, we can always, put your money to good use, definitely planting more trees. Last year we planted a little over 1.1 million. This year we'll be close to 1 million again. But, if we were to increase the amount of funding that we have, we'd just be able to scale up not just the number of trees that we're planting, but hire more people as well, so that, it'd be an additive effect.
So what's one thing that you think is still a problem?
Oh, there are a lot of problems out there with the surface mining. Some of the coal surface mines are still converting these biodiverse forests. The mining companies come in, they cut down all the valuable timber, sell it off. They come in with drill trucks, they blow up the mountains to expose the coal seam, pack all the rock back in there, and then they just seed these areas with aggressive grasses and legumes, and they don't really use the reclamation techniques that will allow for a native forest to regenerate, and they're not planting native trees on these areas. So still, that's a problem, the conversion of native biodiverse forests into these exotic grasslands, which are then colonized by invasive exotic species. It's still a major problem. Now, some of the mining companies are doing a good job, some of the states are doing a good job. But other ones are kind of lagging behind a little bit. A lot of problems with invasive exotic species. There are a lot of non-native plant species that don't benefit native wildlife that colonize these areas. People are still planting non-native invasive species in their yards as a part of landscaping, things like that. And they really don't benefit, our insects and birds the way our native trees and shrubs do. So I would encourage everybody out there, if you're doing anything around your house, you want to plant a tree, plant some pretty shrubs, look at native species, because then you're going to benefit the native insects, the birds, the squirrels, everything that lives in your ecosystem.
Also talking about the birds, I feel like another problem with cutting down the trees in the forests is that we've seen a bunch of animals almost go extinct because of deforestation, like the panda. It's almost gone extinct because we've been just cutting down and getting rid of its habitat. And if one animal goes extinct because of that, the animal that relies on that animal for food, it also almost goes extinct, and you kind of get the point. And the whole life circle just goes all out of balance.
Definitely.
Why should we care about the forest in the first place, in your own words?
Well, forests provide so much to people, from, the paper that we all use to timber for building houses and structures. But they also filter the air, because forests have a greater surface area than grasslands. They're going to take particulates out of the air, so it cleans the air that we breathe. So people with asthma or other respiratory illnesses, it helps them out. but also just living in green spaces. Even if you're living in a city or an urban environment, just living around trees, people have lower incidences of depression, they have better sleep, and that translates to better physical health as well, because they're happier, they're sleeping better. So they really help people out in those ways, but also just the biodiversity and cleaning water, mitigating global warming. There are just so many things that trees and forests do for society. I mean, they affect everybody. Like you said about producing oxygen, they affect everybody, so everybody should care about the forests.
Yeah, the trees are just also the trees are really beautiful. Like in the fall, the spring, they just also provide so much beauty. Like imagine just an artist going out on a hike and just drawing that beautiful tree. They're just so beautiful, and seeing it just being cut down, it's sad. Like you could go on you could just go on a hike and relax and just relieve any stress. They're basically our natural helpers.
Yeah, and like I said, that's what gets back to people who are living in those green spaces around those trees. They might see a bird that they've never seen before come and utilize that tree for eating its berries or building its nest there or something like that. So it makes them happy. It makes them feel better. So, there's less anxiety. It lowers your stress levels, things of that nature. So, yeah, they're crucial for everything.
Once the forests grow back, what are some of the domino effects that happen?
Yeah, so the lands that we're working on, they were coal surface mines, and a lot of them were just seeded with aggressive grasses and legumes. There's very low biodiversity there at first. But when we come in and we remove all the unwanted vegetation, we rip it up, and we plant this biodiverse mix of trees, you really start to see nature take back over, especially when the trees get to a certain height and they get to what we call a closed canopy. The branches come together, they start to shade the forest floor. It suppresses any unwanted exotic invasive species. And you start to see soil building at that part where they're shedding branches, they're shedding leaves. It's laying there over top of everything. And the microbial communities, start to rebuild. They're breaking down the leaves, they're building the soil. And because the trees are now producing berries and nuts for wildlife are coming and utilizing these areas for food, but also for habitat. Birds start nesting there, and they bring in other seeds and deposit them. They'll poop out seeds of different native species. So you see species come in that we don't even bother to plant, native species that are utilized by our native wildlife. So it really starts to take back over, and you start to see a lot more native wildflowers, vines coming into these areas, like, grapevines, and some that people don't think of as being so beneficial for people, like poison ivy, but it produces berries that a lot of birds will eat, So you see it's really a jump starting of the natural succession process. We might plant 20 or 25 species, but if you come back to these sites in 20 years, you might have, 50 or 100 other species that you didn't even plant.
Yeah, I feel like going back to the pandas, before people noticed the problem, they were almost at extinction. But then when people actually started to realize, oh, God, we've been cutting down their habitat, they're almost extinct. They started to work on the problem, and now the pandas, they're in much better care, and they're not as extinct anymore. They're being taken care of in zoos by zookeepers. And people have been working on bringing their habitats back, which, they're still good in the world.
Okay, so how does bringing the trees back help the water quality, and how does it help people in places with bad water quality?
Yeah, so trees and forests do a couple of different things for water quality. It's not just water quality that they affect, but also the quantity of water that enters into the streams and into the watersheds. So there are a lot of plantings that happen in urban environments and other areas, agricultural areas, where they plant these, what they call stream buffer zones. So if you have an agricultural field and they're applying, a lot of fertilizers and pesticides, to grow the crops, whether it be corn or soybeans or whatever, some of that may run off from that field right into the watershed. But if you have this buffer of trees that can help to uptake a lot of those nutrients and prevent it from entering the watershed, they can affect water quality that way. You know, they're affecting what's entering the watershed. But also trees, as they extend their roots out, they're sucking up a lot of water out of the ground. So they're also reducing the water quantity entering the watersheds that way. And also, like I talked about earlier, how they filter the air because of their larger surface area. When you do have these storm events, if you have a big forested area, a lot of that precipitation that's coming down, it's landing on the leaves, on the stems and branches of the trees. So it's not even making it to the soil, but it evaporates off before it can even enter the watershed. So they can affect water quality and water quantity that way. And there are also certain trees and plants that have the ability to take up minerals, take up nutrients, and even take up metals and store them within their tissues. So some plants are good at, accumulating metals in their tissues. So if you have a problem where metals are being leached into the watershed and you plant a certain type of tree, they can help with those problems. They can also, like I said, because they're utilizing and intercepting more of the precipitation, if there's acidic water that's leaching, metals or other things into the watershed, the trees can reduce that's going into the watershed. So you can reduce acid inputs or metal inputs or nutrient inputs into the water. Cool.
How much carbon does a general tree take in?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question. It would depend on the tree species. There are large trees, there are small trees, there are slow-growing trees, fast-growing trees. It depends on where you plant it as well. More northern trees are going to have a shorter growing season than southern trees, which would have a longer growing season. But there's a group that we're a part of now, the 1T.org, the 1 Trillion Tree Community. They have a carbon calculator on their website, and we use it just kind of for standardization for a lot of the other people out doing reforestation. But somewhere between, 1 ton to 2 tons of carbon over a 50 to 100 year period. So for each large tree that you're planting out there in the landscape, over 50 or 100 years, you might sequester a ton or 2 of atmospheric carbon that they'll draw in.
Wow, that is a lot. That's a lot of carbon. Do trees help heal the soil around the coal mines?
Yeah, so I talked about a little bit about the mining process earlier, where when the mining companies come in, they cut all the valuable timber off, sell it to the market so that it can be turned into, buildings or chairs or whatever they're going to use that wood for. Then everything else gets kind of pushed to the bottom of the hill. A lot of times it'll be burned. They drill down to the coal seam, blast the mountain off, scoop up the coal, pack the mountains back into place. And what you're left with a lot of times doesn't really have what you think of as soil. It's just crushed rock and gravels that are left in place, and a lot of times boulders as well. So there's not the typical soil that people think of this loose dirt that's filled with nutrients and organic matter and organic carbon, things of that nature. It's just crushed rock and gravels that we're planting these trees into. But as those rocks are breaking down, they're releasing nutrients, the trees are taking them up, and they start to shed their leaves, they shed their branches, and then you get the microbial community back, you get the bacteria and fungi and worms will come into the areas, and they start breaking all of that down and mixing it all up, and it really starts the soil rebuilding process over again. And on a lot of our sites, if you go back to them in 10 or 20 years, you see that layer of leaves and branches on the surface, and a lot of times there are mosses and lichens and other things growing on them, helping to break it down, helping with the nutrient cycling. So yeah, the trees really do restart that soil building process. It's not really healing the soil, it's converting it and just starting that soil regeneration process again.
That is very interesting. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Willow Waves.
We hope you have learned a lot.